Hey guys, how you doing? It's Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing well. We're going to start to look a little bit more in depth today with our time about the civil rights movement. And instead of just continuing by looking at just what the court has done, we're going to actually transition to leadership. And we're all familiar with the name Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of you know a little bit about people like Malcolm X. But what we want to do is we want to try to look at these objectives that you see in front of you. And so we want to be able to understand the role of leadership organizations that are basically popping up, tactics, strategies, what are the different ways that, all these different leaders try to gain attention and try to sway, of course, opinion one way or the other toward the cause of civil rights. And we also want to take a look at how leaders differed. There's a considerable difference between, of course, the non-violent direct action approach of Martin Luther King Jr. as opposed to some of the groups that you hear about, Black Power movement, when that gets to be more involved in the mid 1960s, and then also, of course, as some of you have heard, the Black Panther movement. We will look a little bit more closely at differences as we transition to our third lecture tomorrow and as we interact with this information in class. We also want to consider a couple of primary sources to give us a little bit of perspective, and we'll get to those as our lesson unfolds. But let's kind of review what we did a little bit. So we were talking the other day about the big challenge with school integration, and we talked more extensively about the Little Rock 9 situation. I would argue, we'll see what y'all think about that in our whole class lesson, that this was definitely, whether you want to look at it as a large crisis or a miniature crisis, it is a situation that requires a degree of presidential action. Now, if you take a look at the latter two cases here or situations, you've got James Meredith. You can see his picture, by the way, in the cursor. And then also you've got the integration or desegregation, if you will, of the University of Alabama, which is going to be George Wallace. Wallace was the governor of the great state of Alabama. He's the one gentleman that you may have heard that said about segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So we're in an area of the country, of course, the Deep South, as a lot of people call it, that is going to make a lot of interesting, shall we say, attempts to kind of roadblock this change. And we looked at that a little bit with the Southern Manifesto. So the question is, how does leadership develop? Now, guys, this is not new to us. We've been talking about issues like abolition, women's rights, the whole nine yards with any kind of reform. And reform usually has people, of course, goals, strategies, and then also outcomes. So what happens? And this is actually posted for you if you want to go back and look at it. So some of these are relatively unique to the 50s and the 60s moving forward, and some of them are actually already around. So I want you all to take a look here. I don't know if you need to memorize every single one of them, but definitely like the NAACP, if you go back and you think about our good friend W.B. Du Bois, who, by the way, is still alive until 1963, keep in mind, Du Bois is basically, or was, shall we say, a pretty big factor with this getting started. He has a little bit of a disagreement with them moving forward, but you'll notice, guys, all of these different organizations or groups, if you will, are going to have a different kind of maybe approach or maybe even a different focus. So if you think about the NAACP, why were they so instrumental with Brown? And the answer really is that Brown dealt with overcoming de jure segregation, the kind of legal segregation that we associate with Plessy and Jim Crow laws and things like that. And if you take a look there, you'll notice the legal equality issue is going to really have a lot to do with the court system. And so what is somebody like W.B. Du Bois going to say? He's going to argue strongly, you know what, we need to have these breakthroughs. And the only way to do that is basically trying to really overcome this in a court, or at least partially in a court. We're not going to say a lot about the Urban League. You can look at that. But core Congress of Racial Equality, again, peaceful means segregation is a top issue. And then I want to bring your attention to the next group, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Who becomes a big leader after the mid-1950s? King does. And King is going to be instrumental, guys, with a concept that we associate with nonviolent direct action. We'll come back to that, but a lot of you might be wondering, well, what in the world does he mean by that? Well, there's a lot of different ways to define it, but for the most part, you're looking at peaceful protest that is basically going to move the cause forward. Now, as we'll see tomorrow and later in the week as we kind of wrap this up, King is going to have his share of critics. And oh yeah, by the way, these critics, guys, are not only going to be within the Caucasian community, but they're also going to be certainly within the African American community. Some people thought that this was yielding the wrong kind of results. It was too hands-on, and it's kind of weird to think that, given that you're doing all these different tactics like sit-ins and marches and rallies, and of course the March on Washington comes to mind in the summer of 1963. But believe it or not, there was a faction, at least, whether it was the majority of the community is debatable, but this faction really does not always see eye to eye with King. And believe it or not, some of those people were actually of the same kind of like background of King, not just African American, but also pastors and religious figures. Okay. And so what does King do with this focus on the SELC? As you can see here, the focus will, of course, transition to the South. And then one of my favorite organizations and its early foundation is going to be what we call SNCC. We're going to read the founding principle of that in a second. But SNCC, guys, a lot of you might be wondering, why are youth important? I mean, you all fall within that category, obviously. And you know what the civil rights movement recognized for good reason, obviously? You know what? These young people, these students, what does SNCC stand for? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They recognize the need for youth to be an active part of this. I want you to think about two things with that as we kind of transition to this in our discussions. One, do you feel like the youth today is maybe respected to the point where their involvement in these different reforms or activist causes are actually important? And secondly, do you think that the youth is actually following through perhaps with their involvement to try to promote change, reform, and of course support things? We're not just talking about the idea of voting, by the way. Although keep in mind, about 60% of Americans, all ages included, are going to actually be pretty active in voting. And that's unfortunately going to be the only real civic thing that a lot of those people do. Okay, so that's a big thing to keep in mind. Now, SNCC will change. We're going to see that today and part of tomorrow, because its leadership changes for reasons we'll get into as we kind of round up our third lesson on this. So what brings about leadership in certainly different ways of approaching things? Well, first of all, the year after Brown, a lot of you are familiar with one of my favorite figures in American history, Rosa Parks. This is going to be, of course, Montgomery, Alabama. That's her picture, by the way, on the bus. If you ever go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, they actually have, I don't think it's the exact bus that she was on, but it's a very similar version. And you can actually go on it, and it has all these neat little interactive things. So I would encourage you guys to go there. Greensboro, from what I understand, has a really good civil rights museum as well. But a side story there. And so what do we know about Rosa Parks not giving up her seat? Right. And so what happens? Well, she's going to get into some trouble for that. This is really where King comes on the scene. And of course, King, as we know, he's only going to be in his late 30s in 1968 when he was unfortunately shot and killed in Memphis at the Lorraine Hotel. But he's a young guy in 55. He's 25. He's well-educated. He gets his doctorate at, I think it was Boston University. So he's a well-educated guy. You ever want to read King beyond his speeches? He's a really interesting writer, and of course has a lot to think about with what he says. But what happens is that basically he's going to advocate the idea of a boycott. This is a nonviolent form of direct action. You're basically, so you're basically choosing not to use the city public transportation. And a lot of people are like, well, okay, why didn't they just drive? Unfortunately, guys, you got to remember, you're talking about an area of the country where researchers have done studies on this. I mean, you're looking at African American communities in parts of Alabama may be having access to 50% of their population actually having running water, working electricity in some cases. So if you think about the economic issues with that, they don't basically have a lot of those resources. So public transportation is an extremely important way for them to get to work, get to places. Now, what happens? Well, the argument is that this is a form of economic impact. You got to have revenue to basically run your buses. And it's reasonably effective. Before I really watch some videos on this, one really good movie, I know y'all hear me reference that. It's called The Long Walk Home. It's got Sissy Spacek, Whoopi Goldberg plays a really neat role in it. And if you ever watch it, just be prepared. It does have a little bit of dialogue that I don't condone as far as some words they use. But it does a really good job showing how this is organized, and then also how it divides even Caucasian families. Like, I won't give it away because that would be taking away all watching it. But there's an occasion toward middle to the end of the movie where a Caucasian woman gets involved in this carpool, and basically her husband finds out about it. And I don't know if he was a member of the Klan, but he certainly was one of those people that was holding on to not changing tradition. And he basically forbids her from continuing to do it, and she did. And they basically, I don't know if they eventually divorced, because it's based on the events, but it has some fictional side to it as well. But you see a lot of just family tension with taking those hardline positions. Okay. And so what do we notice? So King is going to advocate for this, again, nonviolent direct action. Let's boycott. Let's do things like sit-ins and demonstrations and marches. And the question is, guys, if you think about, 10 years later, by 1964, 1965, if you're somebody, again, remember what King said about the idea of progress. Progress is usually not going to be in a straight line. The question is, how would we each individually see progress? Is progress, okay, we have a court case that says that segregation is now unconstitutional, but yet we still have people that are holding on to social segregation de facto, as the legal term would say. Okay. And so this is where we see this kind of divide between, our tactics working? Are they not working? Is 10 years, enough time to really see substantive progress? These are all issues that leadership will have to consider. However, the rise of movements that are somewhat contrary to King, like, for example, the Black Power movement, is eventually going to pop up. We'll look at that a little bit more tomorrow. But of course, the other leader that probably most people are the most familiar with is going to be the rise of Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X's picture is down there. He is not born as Malcolm X. He's born as Malcolm Little. He basically has, let's say, some trouble with the law. And what does he do? He basically eventually spends some time in jail, and he eventually is going to convert to Islam. And he's going to be under, for the time anyway, the leadership of a gentleman by the name of Elijah Muhammad. So they're going to have a different set of religious principles that guide some of the things that they stand for. Now, the issue with this is that eventually Malcolm X is going to become a little bit separate, actually quite a bit separate from the Nation of Islam. He leaves the organizations, or he has a disagreement with Elijah Muhammad. He eventually starts his own mosque. And therefore, you could say, I don't know if I would say he was exactly in tune with King, but he's going to have some different perspectives on moving forward. For example, he's not going to be as focused on Black separatism, although certainly, he does still have a lot of views about how things should be. So why is it a big deal? So you're seeing these clashes of leadership. And then, of course, later on, you have the rise of the Black Panther movement. If you've seen the great movie Forrest Gump, you notice he goes into their meeting and has a fight with the other gentleman there. But what's the one thing? Well, their dress is very different. Their approach is going to be maybe a bit more confrontational, some people would say. Some people would even use the word radical or even militant. Okay. And so what do we notice? Well, they're going to make arguments, about racial pride, which makes a lot of sense. Eventually, you're going to see a lot of attention brought to ghettos. More riots occur. The Watts riot, which Watts is an area close to Los Angeles, California. You're going to see more uprisings that way. Of course, King will have something to say about that. And then probably the most well-known demonstration is going to be King's March on Washington. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. But just keep in mind, that's where he makes his famous I Have a Dream speech. His I Have a Dream is probably, I would say, one of his most well-known moments, where he basically is talking about like his vision of racial togetherness and overcoming some of these things that we've been talking about. Okay, but to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork, King basically in April 1963, which by the way is a few months before this famous march, he basically is trying to convince, especially our federal leadership, particularly John F. Kennedy, who, by the way, keep in mind, does not die until November 22nd, 1963. But I just mentioned to you that King is going to have critics. And so Birmingham in Alabama is a big hotspot for some of these things that are going on. Okay. And so what happens? Well, King is being criticized by a lot of the clergymen, clergymen meaning religious leaders. A lot of them were Caucasian. And so he gets thrown in jail for practicing nonviolent direct action. And so again, people are criticizing him. Why are you doing this? And while he's in that jail cell, he of course has something to say about it. And by the way, the whole document's quite lengthy, but look at what he says. We know through painful what? Experience, that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. That's a pretty interesting statement. It must be demanded by the who? The oppressed. Those that are actually moving toward the direction of having those rights. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a what? Direct action that was, quote, well-timed in the direction, in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of what? Segregation. I'm not yelling at y'all. I'm excited. This is neat stuff. For years, now I have heard the word what? Wait. Guys, patience is running thin for sure. This quote, wait, I jumped something. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that, quote, justice too long delayed is justice denied. Okay. And so it's not hard to figure out, and this is a very short excerpt of a much longer document, like I said, but it's not hard to figure out why this is important, okay, and why he basically supports that. Now, if you're kind of wondering what other things stand out about, the idea of these organizations with nonviolence, guess what? I'm glad that you asked, because I promised you that we were going to actually read part of the part where we were going to actually look at the statement of purpose by the SNCC organization. Now, just one quick thing, guys. I should have pointed this out earlier. King was familiar with SNCC, and he actually did speak to some people at SNCC, but he was not probably the one person that you would want to think of first when you think of SNCC. Bob Moses, who was actually a young teacher, I think was a math teacher, got his education, let's say at Harvard. So a well-educated man is going to be heavily involved, and then the leadership changes and the dynamic changes. But I want to show you guys how this does relate to this approach that we talked about with King. And we're going to read the whole document, and I want you all to think about what it says. We affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of nonviolence as the what? Foundation of our purpose, the presupposition of our faith. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. And the manner of our what? Our action. So let me make this clear, guys. Nonviolent direct action does not mean that you're not doing anything to promote trying to overcome these conditions. It's a manner of which you do it. But look at what they say next, nonviolence as it grows from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that's where there is a degree of connection to some of the ideals of King. Seeks a social order of justice permeated by love. Okay. So in other words, you're not intentionally, doing violent acts. You're not really doing violent acts. In fact, we'll see a picture here in a second that shows the way that the other side of the coin with policemen and other people that are trying to hold on to tradition are actually using a degree of that. And we'll see that on the next slide or two slides. Integration of human endeavor represents the crucial first step towards such a society. Through nonviolence, courage displaces fear, love transforms hate, acceptance dissipates prejudice, hopes ends despair, peace dominates war, faith reconciles doubt, mutual regard cancels enmity, justice for all overcomes injustice. The pre-redemptive community supersedes systems of gross social immorality. That's important. But I like what they say next. Love is the central motive of nonviolence. Love is the force by which God, again, a religious reference, as we can see, binds man to himself and man to man. Such love goes to the extreme. It remains what? Loving and forgiving, even in the midst of hostility. It matches the capacity of evil to inflict suffering with an even more enduring capacity to absorb what? Evil. All the while persisting in love. By appealing to conscience and standing on the moral nature of human existence, nonviolence nurtures the atmosphere in which reconciliation and justice become actual possibilities. And you might be wondering, okay, why did Mr. Baker want to read through that? It's something that we've already talked about. And the reason, guys, pretty simply is this. We need to understand how events entering the early 1960s with this nonviolent approach are actually going to be pretty significant. Okay, so we're not going to cover, of course, all of them, but if you take a look here, you'll notice again some examples of these more nonviolent tactics. Sit-ins in Greensboro. Now, those of you in my home state of North Carolina, you probably are aware of this, and the other folks probably are as well, but the idea of the Greensboro Four. Now, they were students. Now, this was in 1960, I believe it was, so they're obviously young, okay? But these four students started this, basically this sit-in, a nonviolent form of peaceful protest in a Woolworth store in Greensboro. My first involvement in Woolworths was as probably a 3 or 4-year-old kid. You could get just about anything there. Get a hamburger, could go there. I remember students of mine know this. I was a big Star Wars fan. Dad brought me in there as a little kid. Ergo, I want all the figures that they had on the shelves. That's not why these men, however, were there. They were there, obviously, to bring some more seriousness to the topic here, guys, to basically take a stand. And this is not just a couple of days of protest. You're talking about a lot of constant people that are there showing opposition, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they're eventually going to make a statement, and that's a step in the right direction. Then we have demonstrations. Birmingham, we just looked at a moment ago. The one for the freedom rides. A lot of you guys have maybe heard of these, but basically the idea of riding buses to show, to an extent, guys, how much change has actually taken place. And I think it's interesting because they start off in Washington, D.C. Now, their ultimate goal was to make it all the way down to New Orleans. Okay, if you take a look at the map here, guys, you'll notice that unfortunately, they don't actually get all the way down to New Orleans. Okay, so you could say, well, man, their goal really wasn't met. Well, in a sense, you could argue that as a true statement. But what you notice is that they get through Virginia. There are some uprisings, but it's certainly not as shall we say, involved as you will get when you get to this little, reasonably small town, Rock Hill, South Carolina. And then, as you can imagine, guys, as you get into the deeper South, Atlanta, Georgia, parts of Alabama, and then also Mississippi. Remember, guys, from our lesson the other day, by 1964, no desegregated public schools in the state of Mississippi were on the books. All right. So, not to pick on southern states, but the reality is you're seeing that opposition. Okay. The question with this, where does the media come into it? And we'll end with this. Well, guys, as we know, entering the 50s and beyond, the media, especially in this case, the television, is a pretty big tool. Okay. So, city of Birmingham, Alabama. I mean, guys, imagine you're peacefully protesting, First Amendment rights, you could argue. Okay. And these pictures, to an extent, give us a pretty interesting perspective of how law enforcement in the community is actually trying to, I guess, keep matters in check or whatever. But again, the argument is that this is an illustration of police brutality. The question is, guys, if you're an American, I want my students and other students to think about this, just maybe for your own thoughts. Let's say that you're in a part of the country, like where I grew up in Ohio. I grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio, Southern Ohio. It was not a state that required segregation by law. And let's say, talking to my aunt and mom that grew up in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, I mean, there were certainly some racial tensions, but let's say that you didn't see that as much as you would have in this case. And so you hear people talking, well, man, those are really bad situations. We know that pictures are worth 1,000 words. People are turning on the TV set. This is the reality of what they're seeing. And a lot of people are like, well, is the mentality of some of the local people changing a lot? Well, in some cases, perhaps. But guys, a gentleman by the name of Bull Connor, who's one of the more well-known guys in the city of Birmingham, basically makes a statement, and we'll end with this before we wrap it up. But look at what Bull Connor says. All you got to do is tell them you're going to bring the dogs. Let it look at them run. I want to see the dogs work. Quote unquote, again, as I've said on numerous occasions, we are not going to stand for this in Birmingham. And if necessary, we will fill the jail full, and we don't care whose toes we step on. I'm saying now to these meddlers from out of our city, the best thing for them to do is stay out if they don't want to get slapped in jail. Our people of Birmingham are a peaceful people, and we have never have any trouble here unless some people come into our city looking for what? Trouble. And I've never seen anyone yet look for trouble who wasn't able to find it. Okay. So this is a clear indication, guys, of why you're going to have some of these disagreements over the approaches. Okay. Now, to be fair, we focused most of our attention today on nonviolent direct action. Okay. Montgomery bus boycott, things like that. However, tomorrow what we want to do is we want to transition to basically a different set of objectives. So we're going to look at things like, how does Congress have pressure, how does Congress have pressure to actually move us forward with legislation? We haven't seen a lot of that by Congress, a little bit, but not to the extent that they're going to do, especially with the transition to the presidency after Kennedy. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing we want to think about is, why would people not want to continue to support things like nonviolent direct action? Okay, and so we're going to see a little bit more detail on the rise of Black Power, Black Panther movement. We'll talk about those that actually were dissenters of King. In other words, people that did not agree with some of his tactics. And last but not least, we'll kind of evaluate, after King's death, where does the civil rights movement have to go from there? Hope you all have had a great session. Email me or contact me with any questions. And I appreciate your time, and have a great one. Thank you.